So butterflies around Hertford, what, where and why. So I'm actually going to be running through various butterflies, obviously, but hopefully with some information about why they are, where they are, and how we can help them, as Jan was mentioning. So without further ado, just go sort of a word from our sponsors first of all. I'm part of Butterfly Conservation, I volunteer for Butterfly Conservation. I won't read out what's on the slides, but there's not too much text on there for you to read to know what we do. And I'm also here on behalf of the Hertfordshire Natural History Society, whose gift the recordership for butterflies is. So, and you can see in the middle there, working with various other organisations around the county. So that's the background of why and who appoint me to do this job, which is butterfly recorder for Hertfordshire. And so on to what we're actually talking about. Now, I said in the title, butterflies around Hertford, and what I've done is define Hertford as 3 kilometres or 2 miles from Hertford town centre, taking the town centre as being round about Salisbury Square. And that actually encompasses a wide variety of habitats and locations. And I'll just quickly run through them because they'll be relevant to some of the species that I'm talking about. And so if we start up in the north, we've got Waterford Heath, and then we've got Panshanger Park in the west, so pretty well-known sites. And then within Hertford itself, we've got All Saints Churchyard and Bulls Park. Often find, just as an aside, when I go up Bulls Park, how few people actually seem to wander around up there compared to a lot of the other open spaces in the town. I think there's almost a feeling that since the housing was built there, maybe somehow it's private and they shouldn't be up there, but it's actually a very interesting area. We've got Morgan's Walk running south from Queen's Road, which is interesting. Ware Park between the edge of Bengio and Ware itself. We've got the Meads, including Chalk Bank at Chadwell Bank, and we've got Harton Common, which obviously I think too well known to need any introduction. And the 2 miles just encompasses the top end of Bulls Wood at Hertford Heath, and I'm glad that fits in there because I've got several things to say about butterflies and Bulls Wood, which are particularly relevant. And hopefully most of you know at least some of those sites, and if I can introduce you to some people to other sites which they haven't necessarily visited and which are all easily accessible from Hertford, that will be a very worthwhile thing. So how many butterflies am I actually talking about around Hertford? So in the whole of the UK there is approximately, depending on exactly how you count them, 60 species of butterfly, and that's shown on the national map. And within Hertfordshire, we've got 35 species which are regularly recorded. They're either regular migrants into the county or they're actually breeding natively found. And then within Hertford itself, we've got 30 of those species as defined by that circle which I showed you on the previous slide. So you can see that within a fairly small area, we are quite rich in butterflies. Now, what is a butterfly? Because to most people, I suspect it is the creature down at the bottom there on the Michaelmas daisies. That's a small tortoiseshell. It's the adult butterfly. But butterflies actually exist in 4 different forms, and that's important for talking about what you can do for them and the way that they live their life. So they start off as an egg, and then they turn into a caterpillar, which is obviously interesting and important because they're the bit of the butterfly which does most of the feeding and actually gets the nutrition which is needed for the adult to be able to act. And then we've got the chrysalis up at the top there, which is the sort of transition phase between the caterpillar and the adult butterfly. And all of them are important in their own way. And so when people wonder why aren't certain butterflies around at certain times of the year, that's why, because they are around, but they're in one of those other forms. So what I'm going to do is now take us through those 30 or so species of butterfly and talk a bit about them, what their relevance is. And I'm going to do it in not any scientific order, but in the order in which, rough order in which they might appear during the year. So we're starting off in the spring with the red admiral. Now, a lot of books will say the red admiral is a migrant butterfly, so it only gets here during the later spring through to summer and so on. But this is interesting for one particular reason, and I think it's certainly one of the things which suggests that global warming, climate change are real, and we can see the effects of it. Up until about 30 years ago, the red admiral was a migrant butterfly. It couldn't survive a British winter, except perhaps in one or two very sheltered places on the south coast of England. But now it can. It's every year we get records of the red admiral in November, December, January and February. And they're not migrating at that time of the year, they are actually living here. And the reason that they can come out during the winter, so it's the only butterfly you might see in all 12 months of the year, is because unlike the other butterflies which overwinter as an adult, it doesn't go into a full deep sleep of a hibernation, as we'll see for some of the other species. It can actually wake up when there's a mild day or a particularly sunny day, feed, and then go back into a sort of partial hibernation. So that's interesting in itself because it's unique in the British butterfly fauna that it can do that. So it's a familiar garden butterfly. In the autumn, it loves feeding on ivy, and in the summer, it feeds on a wide variety of plants, both wild and garden. In this particular case, it's on a verbena, which is obviously a very common garden nectar source. They still do come over every year from the continent and breed and add to the stock that's already here. So it's not that it isn't a migrant, but it is also a native now as well as a migrant. And it's very common, very widely distributed. This spring, there weren't so many around as there have been some other springs, but there certainly have been a few records all the way through the early part of the year. And I think as we go into May, there'll probably be more and more seen as they are reinforced. The brimstone is probably the species which emerges earliest. This year, certainly, we had some mild weather in sort of early to mid-February, and the brimstones were out then. And this is an unmistakable butterfly because it's only one of two butterflies which are bright yellow that are found in this country, and it's the only one which is here all the year round. It sleeps during the winter, but as I said, it wakes up round about February, and once most hibernating butterflies are up and about, they can't really go back into hibernation. They've got to find food in the form of nectar to keep themselves sustained. They sleep through the winter using up fat reserves that they've accumulated during the summer. So the brimstone is flying at the moment. The male is the darker, brighter yellow. The female is much more of a creamy green colour. And when they're flying together, it's quite clear that there are two different colour forms. Otherwise, they're the same size and they behave very similarly. You tend to see the males of most species of butterflies because it's the males that are flying around displaying, looking for females. The females tend to have a greater sense of self-preservation and stay down low because they're the ones who are going to keep the species going. They're the ones that once they're mated, their job in life is to lay the eggs on the food plant. And the food plant for the brimstone is two species of shrub, the alder buckthorn and the common or purging buckthorn. A lot depends on the kind of soil that you have. So those two shrubs, which are very boring looking plants, they just occur in hedgerows. You can walk past a hedge and not notice buckthorn in it, unless you happen to. You probably only spot it if you happen to notice a brimstone butterfly laying eggs on it. It lays those eggs on the buds, as you can see at the bottom there, as they're unfurling, and then the caterpillar feeds along the midrib of the leaf, feeding either side, as you can see in the bottom picture there, and grows through the spring. Goes into being a chrysalis round about June and emerges in early July. And then those butterflies will fly until the autumn, hibernate, and so the cycle starts again. So the ones that are flying now are the ones that emerged as adults last early July and will fly until round about late June. So this, as an adult, this butterfly can actually live for about 11 months, which makes it one of the longest lived butterflies that we have, as an adult, that is. And the peacock has a similar lifestyle. Again, it's early emerger, has one brood, comes out in July, but it behaves slightly differently. It's, again, very familiar butterfly. It's related to the red admiral, as you might be able to tell by the general red colours and so on. But you can see that when it's sitting open, with its wings open, it's a very obvious butterfly. When it's sitting with its wings closed, as you hopefully can see in the picture next to it, it just looks like a dark leaf shape, so it's very well disguised against attack, for instance, by birds or dragonflies or any other predator that fancies a bit of a butterfly. It breeds on stinging nettles, and you'll often find in gardening programs, gardening books and so on, oh yes, you should grow some stinging nettles because it's great for butterflies. They really love stinging nettles. I wouldn't advise it personally unless you've got a big garden and you're prepared to have a fairly large patch of nettles in bright sunshine. A few nettles stuck behind the back of the shed are no use to it. The butterflies like warmth, the caterpillars like warmth, and they like a large area to live in because, as you can see, the caterpillars live communally. And they make a big web on top of the nettles so that they catch the sun, and that helps them to warm up, to give them it helps give them energy to start feeding. And then as they grow, they all move en masse onto another bunch of nettle, form a new web and feed under that web. And it's only at the end, when they're fully grown, as you can see in the bottom picture there, into quite a fearsome looking creature with spikes and the white spots, that they start crawling off on their own and looking for somewhere to pupate. So it's and they also, unlike the brimstone, although they emerge in the summer, sort of early July, generally by the beginning of August, 95% of them have gone into hibernation, even though there's clearly going to be lots of good weather and lots of nectar sources around through August and September. It's a characteristic of it that it goes into hibernation very early. And it's also interesting because the peacock is the one British butterfly that can make a sound. If it's disturbed while it's hibernating, they tend to go into things like sheds or underpasses, attics to hibernate. If you disturb it, it will actually rub its wings together and make a sort of harsh sound. And the reasons for that are obvious, to try and frighten off whatever it thinks might be a predator. But that's unique in British butterflies. And closely related to that is a small tortoiseshell. And that has a lot of characteristics in common. You can see it has that dark underwing, which can help disguise it very well. It can actually hang off branches and look like a dead leaf in cooler weather. It hibernates over the winter, and it feeds communally on nettle. So a lot of characteristics that are similar to the peacock. Its caterpillar is more yellow and black than just black. Now, the small tortoiseshell, I think many people regard as the archetypal garden butterfly. Common flying around cultivated plants, common in the countryside. And up till about 10 years ago, it was reasonably common, though the numbers had dropped. But in the last 2 or 3 years, it's become, particularly in the south of England, and particularly in the London and surrounding areas, it's become a cause for concern because the numbers have absolutely plummeted. And certainly records that we're seeing this year suggest that not that many have got through hibernation. Now, why should that be? Because, it's always common. It looks as if what's happened is another effect of warming. The small tortoiseshell is at the northern end of its range in England, and in many other countries it lives at much higher elevations than you'd find anywhere in England, apart from right top of Scottish mountains. And that's because it doesn't really like really warm conditions, although they seem to fly quite happily in summer weather. And so what's happened is it's being pushed further north by that. And one of the characteristics of it is it never used to go into hibernation again until quite late in the autumn, They've now started going into hibernation in this country and in this area at the same time as the peacock in early or late July, early August. And again, that is probably a reaction to the fact that they can't really cope with the really warm, consistently warm weather that we now get in. I know it doesn't always feel like that, but if you look at the averages, it certainly is that we're getting during the summers. And so there's a worry that we're actually going to lose this very common butterfly, as at least being a common butterfly, probably disappear completely from southern England as it moves north. So just because some warming moves things north, and there's a lot of celebration of that, it does mean that we may lose some of our fauna. And at the moment, there is nothing really coming in from the continent. You might expect that would be the case, pushing up out from Western Europe, Northern Europe, to fill in the gaps which are appearing. Okay, the comma is the last of our hibernating butterflies. It doesn't seem to be suffering in the same way as a small tortoiseshell. It actually became very rare in the early part of the 20th century. It was actually only found in places like Hertfordshire, but it's now expanded across pretty well the whole country, right up into Scotland. And it's called the comma because of that tiny white comma type mark that you can see hopefully on the picture at the top there on the underwing. But it's the only butterfly that has this very ragged wing shape, so it almost looks as if it's already been attacked by a bird, but it's not. It hasn't. Its caterpillars are quite fearsome, again with lots of spikes, and the white patch is thought to be an imitation bird dropping. And birds will attack caterpillars. It's probably the area of a butterfly's life where it's most vulnerable rather than as the adult. But they don't like eating their own droppings for obvious reasons. So the idea is that they avoid the white mark, and also they don't like the spikes at the other end. So that's the comma. And the comma actually has several broods during the year. So they'll fly now. There'll be a brood in the summer, and then there'll be a brood in the autumn as well. And like the red admiral, they love feeding on ivy flowers. So we're still looking at butterflies that are flying at the moment, so the spring species, but we're now looking at ones which have spent the winter as chrysalises and have now begun to emerge. And the holly blue is one that you'll see around quite a lot. It's very much a garden butterfly. It tends to like urban areas because that tends to be where there is a lot of ivy and holly growing over fences, churchyards, etc., etc. The male is the one on the left with very little black on the upper wing. The female is similar, but you can see it has a much broader black band around the upper wing. And they both have that sort of dotted silvery grey underwing. Quite a small butterfly, smaller than any of the butterflies that we've looked at so far today. And it usually doesn't stray too far from its food plants, and it can be seen flying around them. It also uses quite a few other plants as secondary food sources, so it will use things like dogwood as well. But holly and ivy are its two main food plants as caterpillars. And this is perhaps the archetypal spring butterfly, I think, the orange tip. I've seen lots today flying around, particularly while it's been a bit breezy if you can find a sheltered area. But this one emerges from that wonderful boomerang-shaped chrysalis that you can see in the middle there, usually late March, and then flies through April and May, occasionally just makes it into June as an adult. The male, you can see immediately why it's called the orange-tip butterfly. The female, similar size, but she just has a black tip to the wing and no orange. And as I was mentioning before, that makes her much less conspicuous to predators. But obviously the male butterfly can find her all right. And when they're resting, as you can see at the bottom there, they have this lovely mossy, licheny underwing, which again is a disguise to try and make sure that predators don't find them. And the caterpillars come out and feed not on leaves, but on seed pods of various plants. If you've got honesty in your garden, have a look at the end of May, and you may well find a caterpillar curved around the honesty pod. They also use things like garlic mustard in the wild and lady's smock if you've got a damp area around a pond. And the caterpillars, unlike a lot of butterfly caterpillars, are quite easy to find. They tend to rest in the open during the day, whereas a lot of others hide away during the day. And once that's flown in the spring, spends the rest of its life, that's 4 or 5 weeks as a caterpillar, and then the rest of its existence, so probably 10 months, is as that chrysalis in the middle there, usually attached to a hard surface somewhere. And they're much harder to find than the caterpillars or the adults. In fact, that's the only one I've ever found, is the photo there, attached to a shed in the back garden. And now we come to some of its close relations, because obviously the orange tip is basically a white butterfly, and this is a small white, one of the 2 cabbage whites. And indeed, the chrysalis you see there was attached to a Brussels sprout plant. This is the smaller of the 2, as the name suggests. So it's a medium-sized butterfly, because a lot of the small and large names that you get with butterflies are really relative rather than being absolute. So the small white is much larger than many other butterflies that are called small, but compared to another one we'll see, it is small. And these ones will feed on wild plants, but basically these are the ones that come on your allotment or in your garden if you're growing Brussels, cauliflower, cabbage, etc. And they will also, in the wild, they will also be found in large numbers around fields of oilseed rape. How many of them manage to breed there before the next spray is another matter. But it's a very common butterfly, always has been, and there's no reason to think that it won't continue to be so. So all these ones that I've talked about so far, you may know I haven't referred back to any of the locations that I talked about earlier on, and that's because these are all what we call generalists, where you find them pretty well anywhere. And this is the green-veined white, which is not a cabbage white. You can see it's very similar, but it has, I don't really know why it's called the green-veined white, because the veins are actually outlined in grey rather than green, but that's its name. And you can see that it's very similar, but it feeds on the same kind of plants as the orange tip. And both the small white and the green-veined white, again, will be flying now, then the caterpillars will take over for a bit, and then there'll be another brood later in the summer, probably larger numbers than there are of the small white around at the moment. And then this is the big one. This is the large white, and this is quite a big butterfly, and this is probably the most voracious feeder on cabbages and cauliflowers and so on. Also very fond of nasturtiums. The caterpillars live communally, and they sequester the oils from the plants, which means that they smell distinctly of cabbage and nasturtium and so on. So they're quite bitter, and I think that is obviously to try and stop birds again eating them, because they're not very pleasant flavour. Very dark markings compared to the small white, much more definite looking markings rather than the sort of greyish markings. The females have more dots on the wings than the males. And how are they controlled is quite interesting. You can see at the bottom there's a rather ragged looking caterpillar with what looks like a lot of cotton wool next to it. And that is a parasite. It's a small wasp. It lays its eggs inside a caterpillar. The eggs feed inside the caterpillar, eat out all the less important organs as it's growing, so it still carries on growing and obviously providing them with nutrition. Then when it's basically eaten the caterpillar out to a husk, the larvae bore their way out of the caterpillar and become chrysalises of this little parasitic wasp, which is what the cotton wool balls are next to it. And that's one of the natural controls for the large white butterfly. Perhaps a good job they do, even if their methodology seems somewhat ghoulish. So the speckled wood. This is the first of what's called the brown butterflies, and I think it's pretty obvious why they're called brown butterflies. Male at the bottom, female at the top. Females are often slightly larger than males because they have larger bodies, because they have to contain eggs, so they need bigger wings to fly with, even if they don't necessarily fly as much as the males. Very well disguised if it's sitting with its wings closed, as you can hopefully see from that one sitting on a dead folded up leaf. And they just lay a tiny egg on sheaths of grass. Most of the brown butterflies actually their caterpillars feed on grasses, all sorts of wild grasses. So if you're prepared to have some longer grass in your garden, you can get some of the common butterflies like that possibly breeding. Again, it helps if it's in the sun rather than long grass shoved out the back somewhere, because as hopefully I've established, butterflies do like a bit of warmth, don't we all? But they're not different to us. That's what and as a side, that's one of the great things about looking for butterflies. Unlike a lot of other wild creatures, they like the same kind of nice weather as we do. And you can't say that necessarily for bird watching. So the speckled wood loves shady places, woodland, green lanes, that sort of thing. So somewhere, for instance, like Morgan's Walk, where you've got some shade, but also plenty of grass growing down there. Bull's Woods, another example. But they're pretty well widely distributed. They will come into gardens as well. But they do like a bit of shade. And unlike a lot of butterflies, though not all, it's not unique in this, they don't visit flowers very much at all. What they do, they live up in the trees and they feed on honeydew excreted by greenfly and other aphids, because that's full of sugar, it's full of nutrition, and that's quite a common food source for several species of butterfly. And now we're going to come on to the first of our real specialists. This is the grizzled skipper, and Waterford Heath is your place for the grizzled skipper. There are other sites, but not many. And this is actually a rare butterfly in Hertfordshire. There's only one other area up on Chalk where it's found, but otherwise it's restricted to brownfield sites in the Bean Valley north of Hertford. And it's rare across the whole country. So this is important. This is why Waterford Heath is so important, because it holds possibly one of the better populations. It's a tiny butterfly. You can see it's got quite a distinctive pattern to it, but it's actually quite difficult to find when you're looking for it, because it's very small and it flits around, never flies very high off the ground. It will rest in the sun, warming up on things like flints, though obviously you can see when that lays on a piece of flint, it pretty well disappears. In the early morning, it will roost with its wings closed, as you can see in that picture on the right, holding on to usually the seed heads of something like a St John's wort, and there's an egg that's been laid there. It has 3 food plants, basically: wild strawberry, which tends to grow on disturbed sites, creeping sainfoil and agrimony, and they're all common up at Waterford Heath. Now, Waterford Heath's changed a lot over the years. If you can recall what it was like when it first opened, it was quite bare, and that really was what its food plants needed. But scrub has grown, particularly then with COVID. It was difficult to get work parties out from the Wildlife Trust to control the scrub. And what's happened is, if you've been up to the North Heath, you'll have seen this winter that there's been quite a change in the appearance. It's gone from this big scrubby area, which was getting completely choked up with blackthorn and dogwood and various other shrubs, and the Wildlife Trust, working with butterfly conservation, the Wildlife Trust paid for most of the work, we paid for a bit of it. We've actually decided that the only way we can try and stop this happening is to take drastic measures, on the basis if we don't do something drastic, we're going to lose the butterfly up there. It is still up there this spring, I'm pleased to say, but we're hoping that this area, which was completely covered in this thick, tangled scrub, will actually regenerate with a lot of the food plants, not too much of the scrub, we hope, and provide a continuing habitat for this rare butterfly. And we're very lucky within Hertford, within 2 miles of Hertford, we actually have one of the rarest butterflies in the country. So we move on. So we're now coming to the point, butterflies which aren't flying yet, but will be very shortly. The brown argus is a small butterfly. It's in the blue family, even though it's brown. And you'll see some other blues in a moment. You'll see the similarity. And it feeds on things like storksbill and cranesbill, which tend to grow on the same sort of ground as the grizzled skipper's plants. It's not really a garden butterfly, but you'll see it wherever there's a bit of bare ground, especially if it's recently been cleared, or if it's a sort of field edge that's now neglected or been left for set aside. And it appears twice in the year again, like a lot of the other butterflies, in the late spring and then again in the summer. And this used to be quite a rare butterfly. It's restricted to chalk. But when set aside was brought in about 20, 30 years ago, it was able to move into those areas very successfully because the cranesbills and storksbills, which are now its main food plant, were able to take advantage of that newly bare soil. And so it went from being very restricted just to the chalk edge of the county to occurring right across the county in all sorts of areas, including quite intensively farmed areas. And it's certainly found at quite a few of the sites that I mentioned earlier. And closely related to it is the common blue, not to be confused with the holly blue. The common blue feeds on bird's foot trefoil, which will grow on pretty well any soil. It will grow in your lawn. So an attractive yellow flower, and they will visit other flowers as well. The male is all blue apart from the white edge to the wing. The female varies. Sometimes she's very, very blue, like the one on the right-hand side. Sometimes she's almost looks like a brown Argus, but they always have the orange spots as well. So the females, which have the blue and the orange and the brown, I think are particularly attractive. And this can be found pretty well anywhere. It's not easy to tell it from the holly blue because the common blue will never fly very high up and it tends to be an open grassland, whereas the holly blue's around holly and ivy, even though they're similar size, and a quick look suggests, they're both small blue butterflies. In grassland, so talking about places, for instance, like Bulls Park particularly, but also Waterford Heath, for instance, you'll find the small heath. That's another of the brown butterflies. Excuse me. It's very similar to the other ones in that it lays its eggs on grasses, has several broods during the year, and it never, unlike the brimstone, I should have mentioned this under the brimstone, apart from when it's in flight, it never opens its wings. So whenever it's resting, whenever you see it on a plant, you'll only ever see the underwing, just like you do for a brimstone. So that grey and browny orange view is the one that you usually get. If they really fold their wings down, you can see that they just become a very undistinguished looking little grey butterfly. And that's just a mating pair in the middle there. Just a little bit of video in. And you can see how small they are compared to the flower head of the ox-eye daisy. And another small butterfly, similar kind of size, is a small copper. These feed on relatives of the plants in the dock family, sorrels particularly. There's 3 broods of this a year, and it will come into gardens. It's fairly widely distributed. They do like flowers, though it tends to like the most dry, heathy areas. So again, if you go up to Bulls Wood and just pop out of Bulls Wood and go onto Hertford Heath, you'll find them up there. You'll find them at Waterford Heath. You find them in quite a few places. It's quite a common butterfly. It comes and goes. It has fluctuations in its population, and the numbers tend to build up so that in the late summer, early autumn, September and October, it's actually at its most numerous. And then we've got skippers. These are very small butterflies. The large skipper is relatively large compared to the small skipper, which we'll see in a minute, but it's not a large butterfly. And although it's a grassland butterfly, it will actually spend its time in much more shade than the other ones. And Bulls Wood, again, I mention it, is not because it's a rare butterfly, but because Bulls Wood is a particular woodland stronghold for it. If you walk down in late May through June and into July, you'll often see the males particularly, which is the one featured at the bottom there, sitting on leaves, with its wings facing the sun, taking in the sun and looking out for any males that should tell to go away. You're on my territory. The females are less marked than the male. And then we have the small and the Essex skipper. I put these two together because they're very, very similar. And I don't propose to go through all the ways you can tell them apart if you happen to be able to get very close and at the right angle. But if you think of the large skipper and think of something that's about 2/3 of the size of the large skipper, then you've got a small or an Essex skipper. The reason the Essex skipper is called the Essex skipper is because someone from Hertfordshire in the 19th century didn't publish their record before someone in Essex published their record. Otherwise, it would be small and Hertfordshire skipper. So it's important to get things down in writing. And it's a pugnacious little butterfly. It lives often in colonial groups, but again, they will fly at other butterflies and defend their tiny bit of territory. And they don't really come in gardens, but they, like the large skipper, their caterpillars feed on various species of grass. You can see how important, the number of times I've said that, how important just wild grasses are to a lot of butterflies. The meadow brown is our most common butterfly. This you'll see absolutely everywhere. In terms of it being a generalist, it certainly is. And it flies, we're now into late May and through June, July and August. It's in flight for a long time. Not the same individuals in flight through the whole of that period. What tends to happen is that the early ones emerge, then some more emerge, then some more emerge, so the population keeps rolling on. The male is, in this case, which is again is unusual for butterflies, is the less colourful one on the left, and the female, the more colourful one on the right. And they're often seen on flowers. They like bramble flowers, thistles. Any purple flowers tend to be very favoured by a lot of butterflies. And it's the commonest butterfly in Britain, both by its distribution and by the numbers that are recorded during the summer. So you may see this turning up absolutely anywhere. Okay, we're going a bit more specialist now, and this is the purple hair streak. This is one which I would imagine a lot of people won't have seen. It is associated with oak trees, and it's not seen widely for a number of reasons. One is its most active time of flying is early evening, so a lot of people aren't out looking for butterflies after 6 o'clock at night. And also it spends a lot of time up at the tops of oak trees. So if you can find somewhere where you're high up in relation to an oak tree, for instance, if you go into Ware Park, there's the track that goes across the top goes over the A10. There's a bridge, and there are oak trees on either side of that. So you're actually up almost in the canopy of the oaks, and that's a good place to see them during July and August. It's silvery looking, but you can sometimes, if you see something silvery, because of the underwing there, you can see there's a silvery grey kind of colour, and if it catches the sun, it has that silvery look. You can see them flying around in short bursts around the top of oak trees. And the female is the one that tends to come down more than the male. That's a female there with just a purple line on the wing. The male has rather more purple on the wing, and they often sit with the wings closed, as you can see in the right-hand one. And they feed on honeydew, as I say, like the speckled wood does, and very rarely visit flowers. And they have quite an interesting life cycle in that they're associated with ants. The caterpillars feed on the oak buds, and but in the autumn they actually drop down to the ground and are picked up by ants and taken into their nests and live as a chrysalis over the winter in an ant's nest. So, elm. Why have I suddenly got a slide about elm? Well, that's because it's the food plant of a butterfly we're going to meet next, which is the white letter hair streak. And there is something of a folk myth, I think, has built up that elms are very rare, that Dutch elm disease has basically wiped them out. There's very little around. Hertford has got quite a lot of elm. Some of it's not in good condition, some of it's in reasonable condition. But these two pictures here were taken of elms in the condition they are at the moment, which is before the leaves come, because they have reddish flowers, and then they have these yellowy green seeds. And the two pictures here were taken, the one on the left is actually on the Warren at Harton Common, and there's lots of elm up there. And the one on the right is on the edge of Ware Park. And you can see, again, there are quite a lot of quite large elms. There's dead wood as well, but elms can regenerate once from suckers, once they've succumbed at about 5 metres high to Dutch elm disease. And they seem to have reached an equilibrium with the bark beetle, which causes a Dutch elm disease, so that although we might not have the great stands of elms along hedgerows that we had once, we still have a reasonable amount of elm around. It's not the most obvious tree outside the spring. And there are other areas, there are other places. If you go to Brighton, you'll see lots of mature elms. Somehow the downs have kept the bark beetle out of Brighton. There's lots of mature elms there. I was out walking in Huntingdonshire earlier this year, last weekend, and there were lots of quite large elms growing along the hedgerows still there. I'm not sure why, but it's good that they were. But anyway, that's by way of introduction to the white letter hair streak. This lives pretty well, you'll find this pretty well wherever there are elm. And if you find an elm tree, and this is the time to locate an elm tree and then go back to it in July and look for little brown butterflies flying high above, because like the purple hair streak, it's feeding on honeydew. You'll often find males clashing together or males chasing females, just on very short flights. And they will occasionally come down to flowers. As you can see, this one was up at Waterford Heath on some thistles. They lay their eggs. You can see there's a white egg. I hope that shows just on a branch of the elm, and that's the caterpillars then feed within the buds, and then obviously the adult comes out in the summer. And so it's not as rare as you might think, but you've got to look for it. And it's probably not one you're going to encourage in your garden. It's highly unlikely, I think. Marbled white is a success story. It was confined to the chalk edges 30 years ago of the county, around the Chilterns, North Hertfordshire. It's since spread. Probably this is a beneficial effect of warming climate. It's now spread across the whole of Hertfordshire and across the whole of southern England. It's a common butterfly. You'll see lots of them rather, sites like Waterford again, or down on the Meads. Anywhere where there's thistles growing, you'll find it. And it's a brown butterfly despite the colour. It's not a white butterfly despite the name. Its caterpillars feed on grasses again, particularly one called red fescue, but I think it probably will use other grasses as well. The males are very much black and white. The female, you can see is down the bottom there, is more of a brown and white, and is noticeably larger when you see them together. And they have a very restricted flight period. They're only really flying in mid-June to mid-July, just 4 or 5 weeks. That's their adult life. The rest of it is in the other forms. And with very similar behaviour in terms of life cycle is the ringlet. This prefers damp woodland, so it's extremely common at Bullswood. That's of all the sites which are regularly surveyed in Hertfordshire, that's the site which has the largest numbers. I do the walk at Bullswood every week, surveying on what's called a butterfly transect, and in the middle of early July, you might record in a half hour's walk, you can record 400 or 500 individuals flying around. It's the only butterfly which really doesn't mind it. If it's raining or if it's really dull, it will carry on flying. And it has a very characteristic flight. It's almost as if they're on a little bungee and they bounce. So they love bramble flowers, but again, they lay their eggs on grasses. And you can see why it's called a ringlet from the marks on both the underside and the upper side of the wing. The males and females are quite similar. But it's also one of our darkest butterflies. It's almost, when they first emerge, they're almost black, and then they tend to fade from a sort of dark chocolate to a milk chocolate colour as the flight period goes on. So again, it's not rare. You'll find it in other of the sites that I've mentioned at the beginning of the talk. But we're now moving on to 3 specialist butterflies, which are, the first one is the silverwash fritillary. This is a success story. It used to be common, and it retreated during the 20th century, particularly the second half of the 20th century, right back to the West Country. And then in the last 20 years, it's come back. And again, probably warming. It's a woodland butterfly principally because it lays its eggs on trees like oak, but the caterpillars actually then crawl down and feed on violets, dog violets, which obviously tend to grow in shady places. And that's the caterpillar. That's actually a very young caterpillar. That was probably only 3 or 4 millimetres long, but you can see it's a fairly fearsome job. The birds aren't going to go for that very much. The male is the oranger one. The female is the browner one, less streaky than the male. And they first appeared back in Balls Wood about 2007, I think it was, 2006, something like that. And they're still established there. And they're now established in pretty well any woodland of any reasonable size across the whole of the county. And now what happens is in the autumn, particularly when they're dispersing from woodland, when there may be the females laid her eggs, the male hasn't got much to do, they will actually appear in back gardens. We live in Bengio, and regularly now in the late summer we get silverwash fritillary turning up on buddleia in the back garden, and others may have had a similar experience. So this is a real success story. It's called silverwash. I haven't actually got a picture there. If you're thinking, well, why is this brown or orange butterfly called silverwash fritillary? It's because the underside of the wing has a silvery wash across the greenishness of the underwing. Right, so we now go on to another migrant. This is the clouded yellow. This is the only other yellow butterfly that I mentioned. It's large, like the brimstone, much more rounded looking. Still can't really survive the winter in this country. So it comes here in greater or lesser numbers, usually lesser numbers, unfortunately. The last big year for them was 2001, I think, when there were actually colonies did grow. But it still comes across in numbers. Caterpillars feed on various things like bird's foot trefoil. And it has certain favoured areas where it will appear, and the most favoured are clover fields and lucerne fields. And if you wander around the countryside, as I do, you'll see that both those crops are now grown quite widely in Hertfordshire. Certainly in Ware Park, lucerne, I don't think there's any been planted this year, but lucerne was quite a big crop as a cattle feed, because it can be harvested 4 or 5 times through a year. And they particularly like fields of lucerne, both for the flowers and because they can lay their eggs on the leaves. And when they're in flight, they look much more orangey than the brimstone does. And again, it's another one which rests with its wings closed, as you can see in that picture there. And they actually start the year, the adults come up from Morocco and other parts of North Africa and gradually make their way up through Europe, Spain, France. And depending on what the weather was like in the winter in Morocco, that depends on how many we see in the summer. And the other migrant that we see in this country is the painted lady, which is much more common. Not always a migrant now, not because it can survive the winter, but because it's a major component of primary school education these days. Pretty well whenever I've spoken to children at primary schools or at nurseries, on walks and things like that, almost all of them have had a butterfly kit and been proudly told me how they released the painted lady to help the butterfly population, which is not, I mean, it engages them, that's fine. But this is the butterfly again. It comes up from South Europe and usually gets here in fair numbers. 2009, they were absolutely everywhere. You could see that you stand on the south coast, you could see them flying in clouds above you. They got up from the south coast to Scotland in a few days, and they were breeding everywhere. They feed on thistles, and that's the caterpillar feeding on a thistle. But as I say, they can't really survive the winter. Some of them certainly manage to fly back to Europe in a return migration, but what the proportion is of those that make it and those that don't, I don't think anyone really knows. So we're well into the summer, and we have the white admiral. And there's really only one place where you're going to see the white admiral within my 2 mile radius, and that's Ballswood. It's one of the strongholds for it in the county. Unfortunately, it's a declining butterfly across the whole country. It's only really found in the south and the Midlands. Feeds on wild honeysuckle, the caterpillars do. It's around in the high summer from early June right through July. Used to fly into August, doesn't really now. It didn't used to fly very much in June. It's a big butterfly. It glides like a tropical butterfly. And although you might think, oh, this is just brown and white, it's pretty boring. Believe me, they're quite a spectacular butterfly when you see them flying. And when you see them sitting, you can see the underwing is probably a more attractive pattern than the upper wing. And again, the Wildlife Trust have done a lot of work, particularly this winter, up at Ballswood, to try and open up rides and open up the areas where the honeysuckle grows to encourage breeding, because the numbers have declined somewhat. You can also find them locally if we go a little bit further out from my 2 mile radius. If you go to places like Bramfield Wood and Bramfield Park Wood up on the Woodhall estate, you can find them up there as well. But they tend to only live in the really large blocks of woodland. They need much more woodland, it seems, in the Silverwash Fritillary. And then we move on to its relatively close relation, the purple emperor. And this is probably the butterfly that has the most written about it, the most myths about it, the most stories about it. It's the one which collectors used to seek. It's big and it's purple. And it's an emperor. And it has some particularly disgusting habits. You can see down there that it's sitting on a large lump of poo. And they love poo. If you're feeling guilty about your dog and not picking up your dog's poo where you're walking through a large area of woodland, just think you might be providing a nice meal for the purple emperor male when it comes down. They also like rotting corpses. People also attract them by finding the most, how should I put it, the most pungent Far Eastern spices and fish sauces, preferably left out of the fridge for a few days and warmed up a bit in the sun. They love anything to us is really foul and noxious. This is the males. The females don't do this. Well, yeah. The male will come down. They have almost a set timetable. Between about 10 and 12 in the morning, the males will come down to the ground and look for this sort of thing. They'll also suck up mud and things like that. This is all to get minerals. I mean, there is a serious reason why they do it. It's not just because they've got foul habits. They're looking for minerals. The females tend to stay high up, and then around about 12 o'clock, the males will fly up to tall generally oak trees at high points, where they'll actually do two things. They'll look for females, but they'll also have a fight with other males if other males have found the same high point. And you can see them quite clearly because they're big butterflies. This is one of the biggest butterflies in this country. So you might almost think, am I seeing a very small bird flying around the top of the tree? And there are certain areas where you can go and see them, or have a good chance of seeing them. If you go up to Hertford Heath again, if you know Mount Pleasant, there's a group of very tall oak trees just at the end of the road, and that's a good place to go and see them around about lunchtime. Barden Clumps, just next to Waterford Heath, that's another place where they can be found congregating. They used to be regarded as very rare, which was one of the reasons why people used to collect them, and there used to be a feeling that they were almost dying out. But I think more people look for them now, so we know there are a lot more around. And also I think there has been a natural extension of their range, and they seem to be breeding quite successfully. They spend very little time. The female will then, I should have said, come down in the early afternoon looking for sallow, so the little pussy willow type plants to lay eggs. The male is big, and if you get in the right light, is quite purple. It's quite difficult to get them sitting so they don't just look brown, which is what the female looks like. That one up there, you can see there is a purple sheen around the top of the body, top of the wings. And the thing at the bottom is actually the chrysalis. that's the purple emperor has emerged from that chrysalis. It just shows what the chrysalis looks like. But this is a very big and very unique butterfly. If you really want to see them and you want to go a little bit further afield, the famous place is Knepp in Sussex. But if you don't want to go that far, if you know Hertford Forest near Sandridge, not too far from St Albans, that's also a very reliable place to see them from about the last week of June and through July. And then the final butterfly, because we're doing this by the order in which they emerge and are found in this area, is the gatekeeper. So we're back to the more generalists. It's a brown. It's smaller than the meadow brown. The male has that black scent band across the wings. The female looks similar but doesn't have that black band across the wing. And they are found around hedgerows, pretty well anywhere. They like bramble flowers particularly, and they also will come into your garden if you're growing marjoram or oregano. They love that herb. So if you're on chalky areas, you'll find it on the wild version, but they certainly come in our garden, and they can come in quite large numbers. They're quite communal. They might fuss around each other, but they don't mind the presence of a few others. And that's what they look like when they're mating. That's the underside. So that's really run through the butterfly year as it relates to Hertford, I should say. And so thank you much for listening, and that's the end of my talk.